Hello and welcome to another webcast presentation from the LaRouche scientific team. We are broadcasting live from the Washington, D.C. area, and today is February the 1st, 2014. Now, after some opening remarks, we will be taking questions live through video feed from remote locations from around the country, or you can submit questions via email. And that address is xxi.science@gmail.com. So if you have questions that arise at any point during the presentation, please send them to xxi.science@gmail. Now, the fruits of what are to be presented today were spurred by certain comments by Mr. Larouche in the wake of the decision on the part of the Ukrainian government to reject the offer coming from the European Union, economic offers from the European Union, and to instead adopt a proposal and accept a proposal from the Russians. Now, what this represented was a decision between two types of systems. On the one hand, you had what the European Union was offering and what the monetarist system in general continues to offer, which is extended debt, some monetary guarantees, maybe the opportunity for the stationing of anti-ballistic missile systems in your country, and everything that goes along with that. Or, on the other hand, what Ukraine in fact accepted was an offer for physical agreements from Russia, which included agreements around things like energy, physical productivity, and the like. Now, the kind of decision that Ukraine has faced, and now we've seen because of what this represents globally, it's created a real crisis on an international level. And again, this was a decision between accepting one of two types of systems: a monetarist system or a system which is based on real physical economic growth. And it epitomizes the kind of decision that all nations around the globe are going to have to make a decision on, whether it be nations in Europe, whether it be the United States, whether it be China, all nations. Now, it really poses the question, as Mr. Larouche put it, of what is value? What is survival for a nation? Is value simply a question of money, something which is determined by quote-unquote market forces? Or is value something which is physical? Is there something deeper to the idea of value than simple what the stock market says is valuable, or what consumer interests say is valuable? And that's exactly what we're going to get into today. What, in fact, is value? Now, this comes up in another way when we look at, say, the recent achievements on the part of the Chinese, who landed a rover on the moon and have made it very clear that their long-arching intention on the moon is to industrialize it, to mine it for such things as helium-3. Now, what's the value of helium-3? Why would you ever want to bring helium-3 from the moon back to Earth? I haven't heard Warren Buffett say anything about the value of helium-3. It's not something which is often referred to on the commodities markets. So what is the value of helium-3? Well, in the current market context, it doesn't have a whole lot of value. It's got minimal use, and as I said, it's not something which is commonly thought of as a valuable commodity, the way people discuss gold or diamonds or something. But what's the value of helium-3 in the context of, say, the development of fusion technology, of fusion reactors capable of using helium-3 to produce energy? Where it's been estimated that a single shuttle load of helium-3 brought from the moon to Earth would produce enough energy to power the United States for an entire year. That's one shuttle load producing enough energy for an entire year in the United States. Well, there, value has a very different kind of idea. Value has a physical idea. It has an idea which is steeped in an intention for the future. It has a value which is defined not by markets, but by the human mind and by an intention to advance humanity as a whole. And so again, the idea, the fight around the question of what is value is a fight which is as old as the hills, so to speak. Or in our case, as old as Mount Olympus. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers. As I said, I'm joined today by Jason Ross, a member of the LaRouche PAC science team and editor-in-chief of 21st Century Magazine, and also Leona Fan Chang, who recently presented as on our weekly science show, A New Paradigm for Mankind, a history of the development of chemistry, and counterposed the two differing epistemological approaches to atomic physics. And so she'll also be available to answer questions referring to these topics. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason Ross, and we'll hear from you all soon.
All right, thanks, Cody, and thanks for joining us. So as the theme of this webcast indicates, the continuing gifts of Prometheus, fusion and physical chemistry, we're going to be using the theme of Prometheus to guide our approach to looking at what the value is of our increasing mastery over the physical universe, our creation of new materials, new powers. Many of you have probably heard the story of Prometheus. You might be familiar with him. He was a Titan who, according to Aeschylus, helped overthrow Cronus and put in place Zeus as the new Olympian, the god of Olympus, the chief god at that time. However, you may not know that this is not a myth. This is not a made-up story. It's not fantasy. This is reality. As Aeschylus explains this to us in his play Prometheus Bound, part of a trilogy of which we've lost the other two plays and only have this one, as the play opens, Prometheus is being chained to a rock by some other gods who explain how Zeus is punishing Prometheus for what he's done. He explains. Let's take a look at the first slide here. Put the quote up for you. Prometheus expresses how the goal of Zeus had been to destroy the human race. That as he was passing out gifts to the gods, and when it came to humanity, he gave them nothing, and in fact planned to destroy the human race and send it down to Hades. Prometheus says that he was the only one to object to this, that he was the one who saved mankind from what would have been its fate. He explains that this is why he's being punished. Let's look at the next quote here. The chorus responds to him. They say, could we get the quote up on the screen? They say to Prometheus that anybody who doesn't understand his plight is made of stone. That anybody who would not feel pity for what he is going through would really not be seeing things right. And that actually most of the gods do pity him. Prometheus says, yes, to my friends I am indeed a spectacle of pity. The chorus asks him, they say, did you transgress even somewhat beyond this offense, even beyond saving mankind from destruction, when Zeus planned to eliminate the human race? And Prometheus says, yes, I caused mortals to cease foreseeing their doom. Of what sort was the cure that you found for this affliction? He says, I caused unseen hopes to dwell within their breasts. Now, what does this mean? I caused mortals to cease foreseeing their doom. You may have heard the story of Pandora. Pandora was, after Zeus chained up Prometheus, he sent Pandora as a punishment. Pandora was the first woman, and she brought with her a bottle, which she was not supposed to open, and she did, and all manner of calamity came out of it, except for one thing. You may have heard that this was hope. That's not true. If we didn't have hope, then we wouldn't have hope. Hope is an expectation of good things in the future. What was left in that jar was the lack of free will, a foreknowledge of what your life would lead to. That's what we did not have. Prometheus says that he prevented this from afflicting mankind by giving us unseen hopes, by having no fixed future. This separated us completely from the animals in thought already. Since Chorus asked him, well, is there anything else that you have done? He responds, yes, I also gave mankind fire. Chorus says, really? Do creatures of a day, mortals, do they now have flame-eyed fire? And Prometheus says, yes, and from it they shall learn many arts. That's what we're going to be getting into today. Let's look at what some of these arts were. Let's go ahead to slide 4. Among the arts that Prometheus has given to mankind and that he enumerates are basically everything that we use today. He explains what mankind was like before he gave them these gifts. He says that although they had eyes to see, they saw to no avail. They had ears, but they did not understand. But like as shapes and dreams, throughout their length of days, without purpose, they wrought all things in confusion. They had neither knowledge of houses built of bricks and turned to face the sun, nor yet of work in wood, but dwelt beneath the ground like swarming ants in sunless caves. They had no sign either of winter or of flowery spring or of fruitful summer on which they could depend. But they managed everything without judgment, until I taught them to discern the rising of the stars and their settings, which are difficult to distinguish. So he said, we got construction, we've got the calendar, using astronomy to know what time of the year it is. Let's go on. He says, numbers too, chiefest of the sciences, I invented for them, and the combining of letters, creative mother of the muses' arts, with which to hold all things in memory. I too first brought brute beasts beneath the yoke, to be subjected to the collar and the pack saddle, so that they might bear in men's stead their heaviest burdens. And to the chariot I harnessed horses and made them obedient to the rein, to be an image of wealth and luxury. It was I, and no one else, who invented the mariner's flaxen-wing car that roams the sea. Wretched that I am! Such are the arts I devised for mankind, yet have myself no cunning means to rid me of my present suffering. Chorus responds to him, you have suffered sorrow and humiliation. You have lost your wits and have gone astray. And like an unskilled doctor fallen ill, you lose heart, and cannot discover by which remedies to cure your own disease. Prometheus responds. He says, hear the rest, and you shall wonder the more at the arts and resources I devised. The first and foremost, if ever men fell ill, there was no defense, no healing food, no ointment, nor any drink. But for lack of medicine they wasted away, until I showed them how to mix soothing remedies, with which they now ward off all their disorders. Now as to the benefits of men that lay concealed beneath the earth, bronze, iron, silver, and gold, who would claim to have discovered them before me? No one, I know full well, unless he likes to babble idly. Hear the sum of the whole matter in the compass of one brief word. Every art possessed by man comes from Prometheus. Every art possessed by man comes from Prometheus. So, in the story that continues, as told by Aeschylus, Prometheus is visited by a number of different people. Some of them give him support. Some of them tell him that he's really screwed up, that he's made a terrible mistake for his life, that he could have left mankind alone, he could have avoided displeasing Zeus, he could have kept the powers of the gods to be their powers alone, but he didn't. The question that comes up was, did Prometheus err? Did he make a mistake? There are those who try to convince him that he has, but he knows better. So let's get into what these gifts are and what kind of eras created them. An analysis, a looking through of history, shows us that the natural state of the human species is to develop, is to grow, is to be creative, and that it is only during the times of empire's control that this doesn't occur. So let's go through what these types of fire are. First, let's actually discuss fire. So here you see a chart of the uses of fire throughout the history of the United States. The different colors here are green as wood. This is the amount of energy used per capita in the United States. You can see green is wood. We weren't using coal in the beginnings of the United States. But you can see how as the development of coal became more important with the steam engine and things like this throughout the middle of the 19th century, coal, the blue color here, eclipsed the use of wood and became the dominant energy source. Coal has much more energy per unit than does wood. It's also much more compact, and you can do a lot of things with wood that you can't do with coal. You can build a house out of wood. The other thing is you can do things with coal you can't do with wood. More on that coming up. You then see the next type of energy source, petroleum and natural gas. Petroleum has a higher energy density than coal. You can use it in engines. We use it for transportation. You can see how it has taken over as an increasing energy source. In red, you see fission energy. Those are our nuclear plants. You can see how that could have become the next energy source, but it simply didn't. The petroleum and natural gas are decreasing slightly per capita. Nuclear did not grow. And if you look at the history of the growth of these forms of fire, the amount of energy per capita that we should have in the United States now should be 2 to 3 times what it currently is. So let's talk about why that is. Why hasn't this continued? And let's look at what these uses of fire have meant for us over time. The history of mankind is sometimes broken up into ages named after materials. You may have heard of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, maybe the Steel Age. The Stone Age should probably be called the Fire Age, however, because man's history begins with our use of fire. During the Stone Age, we had art, we had sculpture, we had the development of tools. Wooden tools, of course, stone tools. We had the use of fire to harden those stone tools. We had baking, we had cooking, we had woodworking, we had sculpting, we had fabrics and weaving. So to insult this society and say this is a Stone Age society, we're much more advanced right now, well, you have to look in the context of where mankind is it progressing? But the beginnings of human history, of our written records, go to about the time of what we would call the Bronze Age. Now this happened around 5,000 years ago, and it began with the creation of materials. Let's put up picture 7. This is an image of copper as found in its native state. Just like you find various gems and minerals in the ground or on the ground, copper was actually found in nature. It's a metal that exists in its natural state. 10,000 years ago, human beings were turning copper into tools, beating it, shaping it, using heat to soften it, to change its shape even more, hardening it by hammering, 10,000 years ago. The other examples in this early time were gold, which was mined over 5,000 years ago. Silver could also be found. So metals were known, but the real breakthrough came with the development of materials, almost as if it seems almost like a miracle. This is a piece of malachite. So you can see it's a green rock. It looks like a rock. There's nothing particularly special about this that would make you think you could do anything with it besides maybe use it to beat something or that sort of thing. However, you might be surprised that this is what you can make from it. This is a piece of copper wire. The copper that we use in our homes, the copper that's used for wiring and everything else, comes from ores like malachite. The original development of this discovery, this was 5,000 years ago. This was the beginning of what came to be called the Bronze Age, because of something very special that was added to the copper. See, copper, you could make tools out of copper, but they weren't actually better than stone tools. You had new techniques for shaping them and for forming them, and so that was very good. But the actual physical qualities of copper, once you make the tool, are not superior to, say, a flint, a sharp piece of flint for cutting. The real development came from creating bronze. To do this, not only did human beings have to transform a green rock into a shiny copper metal, they also had to know that if you added tin to this copper, that you would create a new metal, bronze, which is superior to copper, and it's superior to tin. It's a material that never existed on Earth, except maybe in very small amounts, in tiny pockets, that never existed on Earth before human beings created it. Now, what made it possible to make this transformation? Well, here, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is a charcoal briquette. Nothing too special about it. Do you know where charcoal comes from? You might say the grocery store. That's probably where your charcoal comes from. It's made from wood. Let's take a look at picture 8. This is a 100-year-old picture of charcoal production. Looks like a pleasant pastime for these people. You take a large amount of wood, you put it in a pile, and then in the next image, you see what we do to it. You cover the whole pile with soil, and you burn it, as the next image shows. So here the wood is baking, burning, with very little oxygen for 2 to 3 days under all of that dirt. After that time, when you uncover the dirt, you'll find that the wood is actually transformed into charcoal. So what's so good about charcoal? Well, it burns hotter than wood does. It's much cleaner than wood. When you burn wood, there's a lot of things in wood that come out of it, a lot of different chemicals, a lot of different elements. Charcoal is almost 100% pure carbon. So what would be done was the charcoal and the malachite, you would have beds of charcoal, you'd powder the malachite by banging it up, you'd burn it together for a few hours, probably blowing in air to help the temperature get hotter and help the process. And what occurs is that people obviously didn't know this 5,000 years ago in this way, but the carbon from the charcoal combines with the oxygen in the malachite. This is basically rusted copper, and it pulls the oxygen out of it, leaving behind the metal. This is an astonishing thing to do 5,000 years ago. It's an astonishing thing to do today. I think if you do it yourself, it's pretty amazing. The development of bronze meant that we had created something totally new, totally more useful. The next big thing that you could do with bronze, as you see in image 10, is that you could produce cast objects with it. Casting, such as a cast iron pan, means that you have melted the bronze, you've poured it into a mold, it then hardens. Here you can see the bronze being poured in. It hardens and makes whatever shape you had wanted. This is a new thing that you were able to do with bronze that was much more difficult with copper. Okay, so now let's look at the next breakthrough. Around 1200 BC, a shift was made where bronze sort of disappeared in use. The difficulty of attaining the tin for bronze meant that its use declined. You often don't find copper and tin near each other. So with the breakdown of trade routes, which stretched as far as the British Isles, maybe even the New World, tin wasn't available, no more bronze. The next material that was introduced was iron. Now, iron is much more plentiful than copper. Iron ore looks like copper. Well, it's not a green rock, but if you looked at iron ore, it looks like a rock. You wouldn't expect anything metallic to come out of it. But if you do the same process we did with the malachite, you'll wind up with what you see on the screen here. This is called an iron bloom. And it's not pure iron. It's not melted. It still has impurities in it. After you heat it, you would have to basically bang it. This guy's using a sledgehammer. You have to beat the impurities out of it. It takes a lot of work. All that work produces wrought iron, which is very pure iron. It's a trade-off. Iron is much more plentiful. It's much more work to produce it. However, since it's so available, fundamentally it's a far superior source for us than copper is. So that's shingling as the process of banging the bloom. Okay. Now, if we look at the next one, we can see the production of a kind of steel. Steel is iron with copper in it. The blade that you're seeing here is called Damascus steel. We actually don't even know how this was made. We can't produce this anymore. We produce metals that look like it, but they're not actually the same. What you do is you take the iron, you'd lay it on top of charcoal, and you bang the iron into the charcoal. It actually picks up carbon from that charcoal, and the outer layer becomes steel. It would then be heated, folded again and again, maybe 12 or 15 times to produce the metal that you see in this dagger here. Okay, so the next big breakthrough, is just to move ahead through metallurgy, not take all day on this subject, was the use of pig iron. Around 1200 AD, it took this long, so 2 millennia, in Europe. It was used much earlier in China, but to focus on Europe, it took 2 millennia for the development of pig iron, which is when the iron is heated so much that it melts. When iron melts, it picks up a lot of carbon from the charcoal around it, and it becomes very brittle. It becomes hard but brittle. So if you have a cast iron pan, which is made from melted pig iron and then casting it, those pans can crack very easy. If you bang it with a hammer, it's not going to slowly bend into a new shape. It'll just break. If you can change its temperature too rapidly, it'll break. So, not the most useful substance. What made pig iron so useful that it completely replaced the earlier, very labor-intensive process of banging it to get all the impurities out to create wrought iron was the Bessemer steel process. This is around the time of the U.S. Civil War. What Bessemer did was to blow air into melted pig iron. The oxygen from the air would combine with the excess carbon and gas out as carbon dioxide, leaving behind pure iron again, which you would then have to add carbon to by beating it into carbon. It's a lot of work to make steel at this time. The next big breakthroughs were the use of alloys. In the 1910s, stainless steel was developed. Stainless steel, unlike regular steel, won't corrode, won't rust, as long as you take care of it and don't let it sit in salt water all the time. And other things like this. We now have a huge number of different kinds of alloys, very trace amounts, very small amounts of other elements like molybdenum, nickel, titanium. These are added to the steel to give it unique properties. So we've really come a long way. However, in all of this, the basic understanding of the materials has always been, what's their physical nature? Is it hard? Can I make it sharp? How much can I pull on it before it snaps? How much can I push on it before it compresses? How much can I twist it before it breaks? Physical characteristics. The next application of fire to look at is the development of chemistry. Now, chemistry really helped us both make sense of things that we were already doing, and it totally transformed the potential of what we were able to do, because we now understood not only the physical properties of things that we had made as wholes, but also how the very elements of nature would interact. Now, in doing this, Mendeleev understood. You've probably heard of Dmitri Mendeleev. Let's take a look at his table. It's slide 13, the periodic table. You might not recognize the one on the left. That's Mendeleev's periodic table. It does not look identical to the one on the right that you're probably more familiar with. But what Mendeleev had done was to decode matter, to understand two very important things. One was that elements are not materials. For example, charcoal is made out of carbon. Diamonds are made out of carbon. Charcoal and diamonds are very different materials. Mendeleev said that there's a difference between the form that an element takes and the transformations that it is capable of undergoing. He said that the composition of a compound is the expression of those transformations of which it is capable. So his idea of the elements wasn't the properties of the material, like how dense it is or anything like that. His understanding of the elements were what kinds of transformations was it capable of participating in? What could it do? So oxygen is not a gas. Oxygen by itself does form a gas, but oxygen in that green malachite rock, that's not a gas. Malachite is not copper plus a gas. It is copper and oxygen. So from getting into this understanding of what was really going on in the very small, we had a whole new dimension of materials, the chemical dimension. We're not only looking at the physical properties, but now we're getting into the chemical properties. This meant that we could do new things, such as by the use of electricity, which is the next thing to talk about. Electricity is an entirely new dimension of knowledge. Electricity began as sort of an amusement, and it existed that way for actually thousands of years. The word electricity comes from the word electron. It's a Greek word, and it means, you'll probably never guess this, it means amber. What does electricity have to do with amber? What do we do with amber? We collect bugs in it or make jewelry out of it or something. Well, if you rub amber, just like if you rub a balloon on a sweater, if you do that, you get what we call static electricity. The Greeks referred to the material that did it, amber, electron. So that if you rubbed amber, it would pick up little bits of feathers and things like this. And that was about all you could do with it. Around the time of Benjamin Franklin, electricity had really come a long way. Generators were made that operated by rubbing. The first electrical generators were based on rubbing. It's spinning a wheel and rubbing, and they would collect this electric fluid, and you could do experiments with it. Some famous experiments involving frog legs that twitched under an electric current and other things started to increase appreciation for what this substance was, and around 1800, well before that, the first source of flowing electricity was introduced, the battery. A chemical process that created a flowing of the electric fluid. Before that, all electricity was what we would call static electricity, a buildup of a certain kind of electricity, which might flow out through a spark or something like this, but it wasn't a flow. With batteries, we had a flow. This meant a total transformation. What it meant was the connection between electricity and magnetism. Magnetism was also known to the Greeks. Only with flowing electricity could it be discovered that these were actually two facets of the same process. So with an electric battery, an electric cell, a moving current means running, like in a stream that has a current, Ørsted discovered around 1800 that magnetism was actually like a flowing of electricity. That completely transformed its use. People did try to make telegraphs before the connection between electricity and magnetism, but they were very bad. They weren't very useful. Once you had the connection between electricity and magnetism, then you could make things move. You could have the familiar telegraphs that we may be more familiar with, where one person creating a current makes a tap, tap, tap noise somewhere else. Then, the really big breakthrough that made electricity more useful than for doing some chemical experiments where it could be used to pull apart different elements was with the ability to create electricity by motion. So we went from rubbing to chemistry to moving electric and magnetic fields. The generators of today operate by moving a magnetic field past wires, which then induces a current in those wires. Once this was discovered, and once effective generators were made, effective dynamos were made, electricity really became something that was useful. Many of its first applications were for lighting. Even before the filament bulbs that we're familiar with, it was used to make a spark between two pieces of carbon, an arc light, which was very bright. But then the next tremendous breakthrough that fundamentally transformed how we act was the development of the electric motor. So in the late 1800s, electricity made the breakthroughs of being able to be created by mechanical motion, meaning we could use the steam engines that had already existed, and now instead of powering mechanical motion by it, we could use that steam to create a flowing electric current, which is much more easily moved than mechanical motion. You may have seen pictures or videos of old factories where one steam engine with a bunch of leather belts that were just waiting to rip your arm off. Definitely there was no OSHA back then. It was a very difficult way of moving motion. With a wire that goes to a motor, you can now have control and individual machines that are able to even be distant from the source of power. You could make a very large power plant that would serve many different customers, and that's exactly what happened. So, and then with the development of the AC motor in, I believe, 1888, now we could have long-distance transmission of electricity, because you can use a transformer with alternating current. We can use it to create motion, and now we've got a fundamentally different relationship to all the forms of fire that we had before then. You could use wood to power a boiler and make motion. You could use coal to power an engine to make motion. You can use petroleum to power a motor to make motion, like in your car. But by adding the new dimension of knowledge of electricity, those motions can now be transformed, be transmitted as an electric current, and used for all sorts of things. Lighting, heating, air conditioning, which is based on motion, motors, etc. So we've got a whole new dimension, charge. Remember, we had physical properties of metals, we had chemical properties of substances, and now we've got the specifically electrical properties of materials. We're adding new dimensions to our knowledge, literally new dimensions. The last domain to take up, and opening up here, is nuclear. Now, everyone has heard of nuclear power. Many people don't really know how it works at all. Briefly on this, nuclear is yet another new dimension. It's a whole ability to look at the nucleus of materials, which have characteristics that are different than the chemical properties of elements. For example, before nuclear science, you might say, well, what does this element like to combine with? Can we burn it? What materials does it make? What compounds does it form? But now, with nuclear science, we start asking totally different questions. We ask, does this element emit radiation? Is this element susceptible of being cracked in half, the process called fission? Is this element susceptible of being fissioned to create a large amount of power? So the discoveries that led into that, I'm not going to go through right now, but based on our knowledge today, we have a new domain of consideration, a new dimension. Let's take a look at image 15. This shows a new periodic table. Well, it doesn't emphasize the periodicity of it, but this is a table of the nuclides. Now, it's obviously there's too many to be able to really see what's going on in the small there, but the black dots that you see, okay, on this chart, moving up is more protons, moving to the right is more neutrons. The black elements are stable elements. They're not radioactive. The different colors that you see there indicate what kind of radiation do these nuclides emit. What kind of processes are they capable of? So uranium, for example, which as a chemical element isn't really all that exciting. Uranium oxides fluoresce, meaning that shining light on them makes them emit a different color light. That's kind of interesting. It was used to tint stained glass. Okay, that's something. It's very heavy. It's very dense. That's somewhat interesting. But none of its chemical properties are what make it important to us now. What's important is its nuclear property. The fact that we can set up uranium in such a way that we can cause a cascading action of fissions where one fission causes another to occur and use the incredible amount of energy that comes out of that. This is an energy over 1,000 times more powerful than chemical energy. We can now use that as a new dimension of our action. So what this means for us is that we've gone through a whole series of different transformations of different dimensions of our knowledge. The application of them, that's the next thing to look at. Because why have these powers not been implemented? When we saw the chart originally of the different forms of fire that changed what we were able to do, from wood, which makes you warm and cooks things, to charcoal, which is hot enough to use for metallurgy, to coal, which is much more convenient than destroying your forests. Some of the first laws about the environment were passed about 700 years ago when regulations were made to reduce the destruction of forests for production of charcoal. So using coal is much more environmentally friendly than using wood. And then the use of fission. Why didn't fission go up? Why have we stopped increasing our power? Let's take a look at image 18. This shows the population growth of the human species. It goes up to 2000. Now, there's something very characteristic about this, which is that, as you know, it increases very dramatically around the time of the formation of the colonies and of the United States. We also see times of major setbacks, which you might call a dark age. We've seen times where plagues destroyed a third of the population in Europe. in times of economic collapse caused by empire. Let's take a look at the next image. This shows the rate of population growth. Now, some people say the world's overpopulated. They don't usually offer to help that themselves. They usually offer other people as their guinea pigs. But the Queen of England believes that there should be about 1 billion people on this planet. Like Zeus, like earlier societies, like you can go back 4,000 years and hear the gods complaining about overpopulation. Today's environmentalists, really anti-humanists who use environmentalism as another word, they say we got to cut the world's population. And if you look at this chart, it's happening. All right, the rate of growth of the population has been decreasing since the early 60s. Since Kennedy's assassination, the growth of the world population, the direction of change of the people on this planet has been going down. So this isn't an accident. This is being done intentionally. The main way that's being done is through a new word for oligarchy, for Zeus, which is green, which says that the best goal for the human species is not to exist. According to a greenie, according to the green ideology, our goal is to have no impact on the world around us, that somehow nature is good the way that it is, and it's bad if we change it. Now, you wouldn't apply that to anything else unless you just don't like to change anything. I mean, if you've got something that's set up very well, that's good. If it's badly set up, change it. For example, the water flow on the North American continent is horribly designed. A ton of water gets caught by the mountains along the western part of our continent. The rain falls and it flows right into the ocean. Useless, wasted water, terrible design. If you had an engineering firm that designed this, you'd fire them. But that's the way our continent is designed. There's nothing good about it. We need to improve that, bring the water inland, make it more useful, increase the productivity of this water cycle. That's natural. That is opposed by the oligarchical forces, which say that it is easiest to control a population treated as animals when they are kept stupid and when they are kept poor. So I'm going to read two quotes about this. The first, this is a quote from 4,000 years ago. This is from the Atrahasis epic. Maybe I should have asked you to guess when it was from, but here the gods are complaining. They say about people. They say, the load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard. The trouble's too much. So every single one of us gods has agreed to complain to Enlil, the Zeus of that time. The country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. The god grew restless at their racket. Enlil had to listen to their noise. He addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket. Give order that disease shall break out. Overpopulation's not new. Now, I couldn't help but notice that this sounds exactly like Paul Ehrlich, who evidently has some social problems, in addition to his other difficulties. In the prologue to his stupid book, The Population Bomb, which was completely wrong and should prove to anybody that he's an idiot, he wrote, I have understood the population explosion intellectually for a long time. I came to understand it emotionally one stinking hot night in Delhi a few years ago. My wife and daughter and I were returning to our hotel in an ancient taxi. The seats were hopping with fleas. As we crawled through the city, we entered a crowded slum area. The temperature was well over 100, and the air was a haze of dust and smoke. The streets seemed alive with people. People eating. People washing. People sleeping. People visiting, arguing, and screaming. People thrusting their dirty hands through the taxi window, begging. People defecating and urinating. People clinging to buses. People herding animals. People. As we moved slowly through the mob, horns squawking, the dust, noise, heat, and cooking fires gave the scene a hellish aspect. Would we ever get to our hotel? Now, I don't see a big emotional difference between the outlook of Paul Ehrlich and the god Enlil in the 19th century BC of a hatred of having too many people around, disturbing the peace of a few who should be ruling over the rest of mankind, ideally capriciously. That's the ideal type of ruler. And the techniques used to implement that today best fit under the category of greenism, which says no development, no nuclear, every plant is a Fukushima, as though, Fukushima, there was an earthquake and a tsunami. This wasn't a nuclear plant that had a problem, Ask all the people who died there. They weren't killed by that nuclear plant. It's something that we have to completely eliminate as an outlook. We can't compromise with greenism. It has to be swept away, and we have to replace it with a fight for the development of the human species to the level where all human beings, this is the goal, will have the opportunity to contribute something of truly lasting value. 5,000 years ago, the creation of bronze was developed. We don't know by whom. We don't know their names. We don't know what their family was like. But what those people did, whoever it was that developed this, if it was one person or maybe many people independently, what we do know is that that action had an effect which continues today, which fundamentally transformed the human species. Not many people in history have had lives that contributed to making that happen. And the times where it's most possible have been the times where empire was the weakest. The creation of the United States was the opportunity to rid humanity of control over the oligarchism as expressed in Europe at the time by those who founded the United States, to create a society that was able to resist oligarchism, to develop for the well-being of people, and where the pursuit of happiness, the increasing perfection of others, could become the goal of its citizens. That's the goal the United States has to take up again, which will only be possible by ousting Obama, making a complete 180 on our economic policy, the reimplementation of Glass-Steagall, the creation of a credit system, and the adoption of long-term projects for future wealth creation, for the future creation of value, which, as we've discussed today, comes in physical transformations in our ability to live. So that's the mission that we have to have, and I think that this overview, really frankly a short overview considering how many years of history this involves, gives a better idea of what is really valuable and on what economic wealth exists.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So we are going to now open it up for questions. And I'll just repeat again, for those who are viewing that would like to submit questions, please send them to xxi.science@gmail.com. That's xxi.science@gmail.com. Now the first question is one that came in just a little earlier, and it reads, "Greetings. I moderate a small discussion group, and during our chat last week, two women who used to be teachers in the public school system, one taught in Los Angeles while the other taught in the Chicago public schools, brought up the subject of critical thinking as a part of the process of scientific education. The discussion which followed was rather lively, and from that discussion a couple of questions arose which I'm hoping you will be answered. The first question, is the ability to think critically necessary in order to make discoveries? The former Los Angeles teacher said that critical thinking is necessary for discovery because critical thinking skills discipline and train your mind to start observing the processes of the world around you, to ask the right questions about these processes, and be open, alert, and receptive to the answers. The discoveries when they come, otherwise, to the answers of the discoveries when they come. Otherwise, you won't be prepared to make discoveries and record them accurately enough for others to follow." The second question, why do so many Americans refuse to believe in creativity and to accept and embrace the fact that they are creative beings? The Chicago school teacher mentioned that our institutions, including government, economic, culture, and social institutions, either treat creativity as a province of the chosen elite, or they seek to commercialize it and transform it into a commodity which can be bought, consumed, tossed away, and quickly forgotten. She said, our public schools don't even bother to teach creativity and critical thinking and critical thinking, and we're suffering terribly from this deprivation. Art is used to sell products, and what I call stinking products, is leading us to choose the lowest common denominator rather than the highest. It shouldn't surprise anyone that the U.S. is either at or near the bottom when it comes to creative scientific achievements and overall scientific competence. The empire wants good, docile worker bees who have just enough smarts to repair the corporate machine, but who are too stupid or fearful concerning creativity and imagination to recognize the creativity they possess and to use it wisely. Looking forward to the answers to these questions with great interest, and I thank you for holding these webcasts. Sincerely, Stephanie. So I think this is something which both of our guests here can take up. I know, Leona, you specifically addressed this question a couple of weeks ago about the method of creativity, what she's referring to as critical thinking, which I think you can probably elucidate further what we should understand as critical or creative thought. And Jason, I'm sure you've got also some things to follow up too. So yeah, the questions being, what is this ability and to make discoveries, and why do so many Americans refuse to acknowledge the creative nature of man?
Okay, thanks, Cody. I think with all of these questions of method, we always have to have them historically rooted. And this is something I was trying to get at before in the presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago, which is that you can analyze these methods, like, for example, so-called critical thinking or being open-minded and so on, but a lot of that has to come in context with this from the standpoint of history, from the standpoint of the mission that you're oriented towards. And I'll give a good example. There's an extreme version of critical thinking, which is actually sophism, which is criticizing everything. And this is just an extreme one as an example. So you can ask about everything and sort of criticize it. But the question is, are you searching for a universal? That's really where education comes in, because if you can root students now from the standpoint of their existence in, for example, the history that Jason just presented, their existence in a continuing development of really an immortal species, then the type of questions you're going to be asking are going to be different. They're not just asking any question of the subject you're looking at, but they're going to be asking mainly the question of how do you advance humankind and their understanding of universals. So that's the first point I want to make. The second one is that if you look at Schiller's exposition called On the Sublime, he has a very good interplay. I think it also addresses this subject you brought up of how we treat art. And he says that there's an interplay between imagination and understanding. So if you have purely one or the other, you will be lost. You won't make a discovery. If you just have understanding, you will always be in the past. So therefore, you need imagination. If you only have imagination, so if you only have a sense of the ideal you're looking for, then you will be hindered by the subject that you're looking at, by matter. You will think, oh, that's not up to where I am. It's not ideal. And so you need an interplay between both. You need to be able to have what you're looking for, but also be in the present enough to bring that subject up. And so a good example of being able to, when you're making a discovery, you're always in that play, and you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortably in that play zone. So you know that something you're looking for is there, but you can't grasp it yet. And it's going to take some amount of concentration, which is something that our education centers do have to work on. Concentration. It was going to take some amount of concentration to be in that tension zone where you know you're looking for something, but you're continually in this place seeking for it. So, did you want to do something?
Yeah.
Have something?
Sure. Well, I think what Leona just went through actually does a pretty good job of addressing both of those. But on the specific question of why do people refuse to believe in creativity, I think that major factor of that is that the culture rejects creativity. And it does it in ways that we might not be expecting, or ways that you might not think are related. For example, through culture. Culture is a dimension of politics. There is obviously people are poets or musicians, etc. Culture exists. However, much more than people might anticipate, it is shaped by political forces. And this isn't the place to go through the creation of the Congress for Cultural Freedom after World War II and everything like that. But all around us, the very short, silly little songs that we hear on the radio, for example, they sort of get you in the mode of thought where, a full idea is expressed in 3 minutes, which consists of a 20-second thing repeated 20 times with a brief interlude every 5 times. Also, how do you implement it? What are the opportunities for implementing creative things right now? Is fusion research being financed the way it would be if we were serious about achieving it? It isn't. Is the research needed to cure AIDS, for example, being researched the way it really should be? No, not at all. Are children, are they confronted by the need to be creative in school? Not typically. Especially more and more with the stupid Bush education programs and Obama's even worse ones, children don't learn how to know things, they learn how to take tests, which would be I suppose that would be useful if advancing society was based on taking tests. The creation of bronze wasn't based on taking a test, it was doing something totally new. So education has to be based on the primary sources, based on the actual discoveries that advanced us. Recreate those. Read Mendeleev's Elements of Chemistry. It's absurd that people are able to get a degree in chemistry without even reading Mendeleev's book or Lavoisier's book. You can get a PhD in chemistry and not know how Mendeleev created chemistry. That is ridiculous. So I think that it gets to a broader question of how do we reform culture, and in particular, it definitely means how do we have to base our educational system on fostering creativity as opposed to learning how to fill in bubbles very precisely.
All right, thanks, you two. Yeah, it's very clear. The intention is not there to develop the creative potentials of our population. You see that in what you've gone through. The intention is to breed stupidity. And when it comes to breeding, the less the better in the eyes of the queen. So our next question comes from, looks like a fellow Stanford alum, Jason. And this is from Howard, who says, "Great presentation. Great chance to read or reread Aeschylus. The most surprising of the Promethean gifts itemized by Aeschylus is the gift of, quote, blind hopes. David Green, in an article on the Prometheus bound in Classical Philology, 1940, makes an interesting argument that this gift is connected with a passage in Plato's Gorgias, by which he would argue that the Promethean gifts of blind hopes to man is a reduction of man's natural animal instincts as a kind of trade-off for the gifts of reason and science, and in particular, the inability to foreknow the day of their death, as many animals seem to know. According to Green, the gift of blind hopes thus means the withdrawal of a sense of individual destiny and mortality in favor of the harboring of individuals' knowledge in a more communal or collective operation of speculative and practical science. Apparently, per Green, blind hopes now drives individual man onward in pursuit of a future that he himself as an individual will perhaps never realize, as he, lacking all foreknowledge of his death, will be blindly overtaken by it at an hour you know not when. Among the gifts of Prometheus, what do you suppose the strange gift of blind hopes might mean? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. That's actually this is a very personal one for me, because I've this story about Pandora, and as you had expressed it, what the blind hope would mean, which I wonder if it's an irony intended by Aeschylus, in that the hope that was left in Pandora's bottle, where hope's really not the right word. I mean, anticipation might be more appropriate. The Greek word can mean both an anticipation of good things in the future, which we call hope, or an anticipation of bad things, which we would call dread. So there might be a pun over time being used in how that word's used in the Pandora story and then in Prometheus Bound. But I completely agree with the way that you've put it. That's the way I had heard the story some years ago in an etymology class, that indeed the foreknowledge of the day of your death, the foreknowledge of where your life would go, that's what the gift of blind hope, or again, blind is also an unfortunate word. The word, I was talking to somebody who knows Greek about this, and blind would be the appropriate translation if it applied to a person, like a blind person. But it can also simply mean unseen. So the hopes, they're blind, and that you're not worried about dying, knowing already when that will occur, but also that you have hopes for things yet unseen, which might also be a double meaning there. I don't know enough Greek to comment any more than that, but thank you very much for your question and for that source, because I think that's absolutely the interpretation that really, I think, makes the most sense. The Prometheus gave us the gift to live life, to do new things, and not to... And basically, that's the same thing as having free will. Your future isn't predetermined. That's the gift that is the first one that makes humanity different from an animal. Fire is very general, but that's even more general.
All right, thanks. So the next question comes from one of our fellow activists, who asks, in reference to Obama's State of the Union and science policy, in addition to the points raised by Mr. LaRouche in last night's webcast regarding Obama's shameful State of the Union address, including the exploitation of a wounded veteran, there are several points which the basement team could comment on, which all seem related in terms of a scientific outlook which he put forward. First of all, in light of the recent landing of a Chinese rover on the moon, which has clearly captured the attention of the world, and especially the U.S., was the fact that he did not even mention NASA or the U.S. space program or any vision for this. But in terms of what was said, he bragged about how much the U.S. is increasing its use of solar energy. But this was in the context of praising the fact that overall energy consumption in the U.S. is decreasing. This is perhaps related to his assertion that climate change, implying man-made climate change, is a fact, that this issue is settled and that there should be no further debate on this. How are these various statements regarding science and technological policy related? And what do they imply as far as an outlook for our country?
Okay, I can mention something. Maybe you have something more. Of course, the more obvious one is we use less energy because we do less. And you probably know that because everything you pick up and everything you've bought is made somewhere else. But that's actually a less a substantial point of it. The main thing is that Obama and his staff, whatever you call them now, have an intention to kill you. And that's really the underlying subject of the whole, every proposal and the way that things are being brought up. I mean, people have known the climate changes since probably the beginning of people. But the question is, how is this being brought up? Are you bringing up, well, we already know how it's being brought up. It's being brought up to say that human beings are destroying themselves and the earth, and therefore there should be less of them. It is notable that he didn't bring up the fact that we just landed on the moon again. Yeah, and then because if any of this were truly honest, it would be the same points could be brought up in a completely different environment, and to demonstrate a completely different point. For example, if we were really actually concerned about climate change or the climate in general, we would have built Nawapa a long time ago. We would have purposefully, changed the climate from the standpoint of being able to relieve these incredibly disastrous droughts in the West right now, and been able to understand the weather much more from that test or from that investigation. But really, that's the main point. It's you can see through all of the so-called arguments that the intention right now is, 1, to take control, to take dictatorial control, and 2, to use it to depopulate. Is there something more?
Quick thing. Just to address the climate change thing directly but indirectly, I found that on almost any topic, as it's discussed in, I hate to use the phrase, mainstream media, there's always something else going on. There's always an insider view, no matter what the topic is. It's generally, something gets presented, but if you don't know about the subject, it's really not worth that much, which does mean you do have to actually develop a knowledge about any subject before you know anything about it. That means that you don't develop knowledge by consensus. It's not the quantity of views. I mean, you might say that if a lot of people think something, maybe it's at least worth looking at, but that's not how you decide whether something's true. Michael Crichton wrote in addition to all of his books, he wrote a very funny article called Aliens Cause Global Warming. And in it, he explains why the title of his paper makes as much sense as anything else said about global warming. He says, what's the deal with consensus? When does science ever work by consensus? Do we say that 98% of scientists agree that E equals mc squared? Do we say that 73% of scientists polled agree that the distance of the moon from the Earth is such and such many kilometers? That's only brought up when the science for something doesn't actually exist. And I don't want to say anything more specific about the global warming thing. There's plenty of stuff to read about it. It is simply used as a way of promoting the reduction of population. I mean, if you were sitting around a room scheming of the best possible thing to reduce in order to reduce the human population, it would be carbon dioxide. I mean, almost all of our energy use involves the production of carbon dioxide. So if you want a convenient proxy for saying we want less people, just say, we want less carbon dioxide. And if we could make up something that that supports the claim that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, then you get your way. Oh yeah, right. And we produce carbon dioxide. Yeah.
Yeah, to save the environment, hold your breath. So our next question that comes in asks, one of the key roles of empire, which is obviously a subject here today, as a means to divide and conquer, is a sort of inverse golden role, where you have your victims do unto themselves what you, as conqueror, would otherwise have to do yourself to conquer them. The suppression of knowledge, science, technology, etc., is not simply a willful acceptance, but an obvious type of self-victimization and self-perpetuation of Zeus's powers. This often takes the form nowadays in the attitude, well, you can't do anything about it anyways, we'll just have to see what happens. Can you please comment?
Well, that's a pretty good formulation of the alternative golden rule: do unto yourself what otherwise I would do to you. And it's exactly the way things play out, as we've discussed already somewhat about culture, about getting people to enslave themselves. I mean, it's much easier. Frederick Douglass's autobiography addresses this pretty well, about how the ideal way for the slave owners to control the slaves was, to the extent possible, to get those slaves to enslave themselves, to believe that they deserved to be in bondage, to think of themselves that way. And then the physical chains, the physical force, were less necessary. So think about how we're swarmed with this green stuff everywhere. I mean, everywhere you look, there's something proclaiming how green it is and how much % less plastic this bottle is using and all these things. It just being around all of that gives you this image that we're just supposed to use less. It's just around us. People who even wish they didn't think that, it just sort of gets in the air. So the way to break through on that is to create self-consciously in people an identity that is creative and that is Promethean. So we talked some earlier about what that would mean for education, how that would have to change to represent this. And it also means something about what we do politically, where people's political decisions aren't based on elections per se, if you're waiting for an election to make your voice heard, you waited too long, because the odds are the candidates you might be voting for might neither of them be that great. What it means is citizens taking responsibility for the nation. And that's what a citizen really has to do. You can't, Ben Franklin, in this possibly apocryphal story, after the Constitution was formed, he was asked, "What kind of nation did you give us, Dr. Franklin?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." The only way to keep a republic is when the citizenry, at least enough of the citizenry, takes seriously for themselves the responsibility for having a knowledge of where that society ought to go, an understanding of history, and an understanding of economics. That's an identity that more citizens need to take up urgently to make the changes that will ensure our survival possible. We will not survive. It is impossible without a change in the culture of what it is to be a citizen in the United States.
Okay, so next I'm going to ask a set of questions that come from a group that are watching in the Baltimore area. The first question is, why should there be a contradiction between progress and a better something of the environment? Maybe a better state of the environment. I'm not sure what the word is there. So that. Number two, where do you stand on nuclear power? And three, we should, for the progress of science, avoid arguing with those who choose to deviate from sound principles and deviate from the scientific method. And this is from a former NASA employee. So again, he says, we should, for the progress of science, avoid arguing with those who choose to deviate from sound principles and deviate from the scientific method. Comment on that. So again, the contradiction between progress and a better state of the environment, should that necessarily be the case. What do you think about nuclear power? And a statement from a NASA employee saying we should just avoid arguing with those who choose to deviate from sound principles and the scientific method.
Okay, I'll take up the nuclear power one first. We've published a lot now on nuclear power. I think the way I have to think about it is that nuclear power is incredibly, well, let's say this. What most people think of as nuclear power is from the 1950s, before that even. And we should have been at fusion, nuclear fusion, how many years ago now? In the 80s, really in the 80s. And so, in a sense, we're catching up with ourselves. And what that means is not just power. You've seen it now in a few reports that we've put out now on nuclear fusion and NWAPA. But really, you're dealing with an entire advancement, entire transformation of society that should have become already. And honestly, if you had a society who had already adopted full-on, the entire full-on nuclear process of fission, fusion, we would not have a society that would accept the conditions that are being implemented, that are being imposed today. So that's it. Yes, support nuclear power. It must advance much, much faster than it is now. I think it's a proven point that the new fusion reactor, the ITER, is in France, where they can support something like that, where they have, what's the percentage? 95%. A high percentage of their power being supported by nuclear fission, including exports to Germany, who got rid of many of their nuclear plants. So that's one thing. I'll say something on the third question, and you probably have some more, which is that often what people claim are sound principles are very various. People have very different measures for what are sound principles. There is one advantage to taking arguments from people who are zealous about something they don't know, and that's mainly as a foil to show something that's true. Then there is the other side, which is current science today considers all metaphysics unscientific. And what I mean by that is that anything that is a hypothesis that goes far beyond our current ability to prove it is sometimes considered not sound. And I think a lot of the major discoveries of science that we depend on now, including Kepler's hypothesis, even Einstein's hypotheses, would be considered unsound today. So.
Those are some good questions. To address the first one, no, there is no inherent disparity between progress and improving the environment. The actual environmental conditions in wealthy nations are better than those in developing countries per capita. If you have a developed economy, are you going to would you have filthy water? Of course not. You'll clean it up. If you're unable to keep things clean, then they're likely to be dirty. Another thing is about the environment. I mean, if you want to talk about air pollution, for example, look, most of the air pollution experienced by people on this planet, besides cigarettes they're smoking, is the use of biomass for cooking in their homes. Cooking, you're burning dung. I mean, millions of people, tens of millions of people burn dung to cook their food, which probably also doesn't make it taste very good. But it also creates a tremendous amount of air pollution. How about water pollution? Well, in the developing world, I forget the statistic now, but between a third and a half of all diseases that are impacting people's lives in the third world, either a third or a half of that is attributed to poor sanitation, where the major pollutant in the water isn't a tannery pouring its chemicals in it, it's human beings defecating and releasing parasites and diseases into that water that is then used for drinking purposes. So in terms of the actual pollutants that we have overcome through the use of water treatment systems, I mean, the amount of actual water pollution that is experienced by somebody where there's, a water system, a municipal water system, as opposed to going to a stream and getting a bucket of water, well, the water you're experiencing as a person, it's not very polluted if you've treated it. So no, there's no disparity between that. We improve the environment when we progress, and if we actually are making things bad around us, well then you don't have to have a separate environmentalist category for that. That's not progress. It's making things dirty. I think that would be good. On the third thing, just something quick about whether we should talk to scientific deviants or have arguments with them. Sometimes it's a losing battle to get into a tit for. It's almost always a losing battle to get into a tit for tat with somebody who doesn't know anything on a specific subject. It's difficult to bring things to a higher level sometimes. Sometimes you have to flank it completely by just getting their mind working better in another field to make people more intelligent overall, by promoting other opportunities for experiencing creative and critical thought. The New Paradigm for Humanity shows that we do every Wednesday on this website are an example where we bring various aspects of scientific and political method up for discussion as a way of overall acting to raise the level of discussion on those topics. So thanks for the questions.
Okay, our next question comes from our grouping assembled in the New York City area, and this is from Giselle, who asks, what was Thomas Edison's role in the development of electricity, and how did the New York City oligarchy try to thwart Edison's efforts?
Well, it's funny. Nearly any technological innovation gets attacked. The New York Times said that riding in a train would kill us because our bodily organs couldn't handle speeds over, I think they said 12 miles an hour or 15, or I mean, you can do that on a horse. So I don't know how they even wrote that. But also, electricity was attacked by, for example, the gas companies, who had the very, people lighted their homes in the safest manner you can imagine. They had gas coming out of pipes on their walls, and then they lit it. So you can see why electricity is a big improvement. So yes, Edison was attacked on this. It's interesting that you pose the question that way, because what people typically hear on this subject is about how Edison attacked Westinghouse. There's another side of the story, and a somewhat unfortunate one, which is worth a brief remark. Edison, beginning with his Pearl Street station, provided direct current electricity. Very briefly, the importance of the two kinds of electricity, the direct flowing electricity and the alternating current that goes back and forth that we use in our wall outlets in our homes, is that when current moves back and forth, you're bringing out the electromagnetic character of it. What that means is that when the electricity is changing what it does, you can use that to induce another current. It's almost like a non-moving generator. What that means is that you can transform the voltage of the electricity, which is important for transmitting it. Our high voltage electrical lines have a very small current, which reduces the thickness of the wires that's needed. That made alternating current fundamentally far superior to direct current, and with Tesla's development of the AC motor around 1888, it meant that AC was, it was meant to become the real kind of power that we would use. Edison, unfortunately, wasn't exactly all that happy about it because he had adopted the other system, but it still points out that you're going to find you find forces that oppose technology. In his case, the gas companies aren't exactly the oligarchy per se, but you often do find a resistance to implementing new things, which as a society we can't tolerate that. We have to develop.
Okay, so this is a question that came into our Ask LaRouche thing, but we'll pose it here to you guys and see if you can handle it. The person originally asked, this is from Rob, Dear Mr. LaRouche, I recently mentioned you and your organization to a friend of mine. After he referred to your website, he made the summary statement, "This is all scientism." After looking up what scientism means, I have to agree with this synopsis of your worldview. Is this an accurate portrayal of what you promote, or do you disagree? May God bless you. I also had to look up exactly what this word scientism means, and I'll give you at least one of the definitions I came across, and perhaps you guys can tell us whether or not this accurately defines who we are. So, this is from Wikipedia. Scientism is a term used to refer to belief in the universal applicability of the scientific method and approach, and the view that empirical science constitutes the most authoritative worldview or most valuable part of human learning to the exclusion of other viewpoints. It has been defined as, quote, the view that the characteristic inductive method of the natural sciences are the only source of genuine factual knowledge, and in particular, that they alone can yield true knowledge about man and society. The term scientism frequently implies a critique of the more extreme expressions of logical positivism and has been used to describe the dogmatic endorsement of scientific methodology and the reduction of all knowledge to only that which is measurable. So, does that adequately describe our world outlook, or is there something more?
Well, I can see why somebody might be drawn to that definition. It is a little bit simplistic. I mean, the idea that it's a funny phrase, the idea that science is used to the exclusion of others. This makes me think of, this earlier questioner is making me think back to some of my unpleasant experiences in college, including a terribly multicultural class, which was based on the idea that there are no privileged viewpoints for different narratives. Narrative is also a terrible word. That science has its narrative, but you also should consider how do people from this society view something, etc., whether or not they have particular competence to talk about that subject or not. Yes, it does make sense to use science as opposed to superstition. That's, I think, reasonably unarguable. However, what science means is it's a really loaded word. I mean, the word, like as the third question from Baltimore addressed this, what scientific method means, that is an incredibly hot potato question. What does it mean to be scientific? So there have been fights about what scientific method means. For example, Aristotle basically said that he knew everything, and if you read his books, it's him expounding about how everything is. It's not a method for developing knowledge, not the way Socrates expresses for us through Plato. Since it was pretty obvious that Aristotle was wrong about almost everything that he had specific thoughts on, a development was made by the oligarchical faction with the philosophy of Paolo Sarpi. Sarpi said, yes, we should use observations. We shouldn't base knowledge on what we think about things without doing any experimentation. That's absurd. However, what Sarpi said was the way to achieve knowledge unnecessarily, unfairly, wrongly excluded a real scientific development. It said that science occurs basically by induction, that we observe things happening, that we draw a general conclusion about those observations, and that we then expect that observation to continue into the future. I think Leona did a good job of addressing what's missing in that outlook. However, on the other side, that there is also, you can't make a distinction between science and art. That doesn't just mean that we have to consider human souls, although we do. We do have to, there is something about the way our minds and our souls work, about the way that we think, about emotions. These aren't things that can simply be discounted and eliminated. People are emotional beings. However, the idea that then there's no standard of truth in art is wrong. And the idea that art will have no useful bearing on science is also wrong. As Mr. LaRouche wrote in a recent paper, the current master of both science and art will have to give way to a new concept that's developed from the two together. What that means is that we are able to experience and recreate and do fresh, creative things in the physical sciences. At the same time, we can learn from the development of culture. We can learn from the breakthroughs in music that gave us, for example, the 12 notes of the scale. It didn't just fall out of the sky. This is a discovery, the way that works. The tuning that's most in coherence with the way physical bodies are, with the singing voice, that's something to discover. It's a scientific aspect of culture. But so too is the nature of what the compositions say. I mean, we're used to hearing almost all the popular music involves words, so people actually they explicitly say things to you, and usually not very interesting ones. The other aspect is what the music says. So if you look at classical music, you have operas, you have songs that involve words. You also have a symphony, which doesn't. So what is that symphony, what is that sonata saying? Is it giving you a specific conclusion or a specific thought? Is it illustrating a method of approach? And sometimes these, particularly a string quartet, it sounds like a discussion among four people, and you think to yourself, are those people intelligent? Is this a conversation that's going somewhere? Do they sound boring, like they're not listening to each other? Do they sound repetitive? Do they sound stupid? Or do they sound like they're actually going somewhere? So we can learn something from the music of the... you got to be careful with the word classical. Most of what a classical radio station plays is not very good. But if you're more specific about it, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, the really, Schumann, the really greatest composers, what they express through their music is a form of creative thought that can inform and improve the practice of science. If we take some of the greatest, probably people would say the two greatest discoveries of the past century, or at least a century ago, they were the discovery of the quantum by Max Planck and the theory of relativity by Albert Einstein. Music played a very important role in these men's lives. Planck was an excellent amateur pianist, and Einstein and his violin were constant companions. His music wasn't just an escape from the humdrum world of the laboratory. For Einstein, his music helped provide new ways of thought that helped him make the discoveries that he did in his life. So on the scientism, I would try to pull that together. I'd say, yes, we should base things on knowledge and not superstition. We can't leave out the role of culture, and scientific method is itself it itself is something you really have to figure out. It's not what you heard in 8th grade when you were planning out your science fair project about vinegar and baking soda.
Okay, our next question comes again from our group gathered in New York City. This is from Omar Smith from Queens, New York, who asks, with China moving on helium-3, what else does man need to fully apply helium-3 for mankind?
Well, we do need to, as Cody had said in the introduction, we do need to do more than simply have the helium-3. For example, having a bunch of iron ore isn't any use to you if you don't have a blast furnace. Having a lot of oil is no use for you if you don't have an engine to use it. If you were trying to dig a well and you got a bunch of oil and you couldn't use it, it's useless to you. So the helium-3 will be useful in conjunction with the developments in fusion here on Earth that need to happen to make it a viable energy source. Currently, it isn't. We have not made the breakthrough. As Leona had said, our idea of nuclear science is, a lot of it's back in the 50s. We have not made the next breakthrough that we should have made 30 years ago. The next breakthrough that was attacked by the chronic, deliberate underfunding and destruction of fusion research. If this isn't one of the clearest examples of Zeus attacking the use of fire, it would be the view of an oligarchy to the development of fusion. With fusion, so many limits to human life disappear completely. The idea of electricity too cheap to meter, of fundamentally new ways of transforming metals. For example, almost all, the vast 70% of steel made today is produced using coal, which is transformed into coke to use in a blast furnace. The nuclear age would mean that would be a thing of the past. That instead of using the chemical properties of the coke, which is coal that's been transformed like wood into charcoal, the chemical properties of coke, which is to pull the oxygen out of the iron ore, would be replaced by the electrical characteristics of iron and the oxygen bound to it. Where with plasma processing and magnetic separation, which we would do in an economy with fusion as its platform, we'd totally transform the way that we make ores. We'd change the different processes that we use today for making steel, which involves coke ovens, a blast furnace, and then a basic oxygen furnace to refine it, or aluminum, which involves electrolysis. These totally different processes, these multiple processes, could be condensed into one, where we're acting on a higher dimension of those elements, moving beyond the physical, moving beyond the chemical into the electromagnetic, and into the nuclear. So we have to make those breakthroughs. The ITER was mentioned, the large project in Europe, the next big tokamak fusion project. But we need to dramatically increase our financing and work on fusion projects, including other novel ones, to make the breakthrough that would then make helium-3 a wonderful resource for us based on the nature of it as a fuel, based on the kinds of reactions that helium-3 would undergo as a fuel, as opposed to the other materials like deuterium and tritium that we're using currently to get there.
One more thing to add also is the development of our space program, and because one of the major things, one of the outstanding characteristics of the program that China has launched are these different hints that they have not just launched the lunar landing program as a touch and go. That you can tell from the different the different aspects of their program, which include looking for helium-3, that they're going for full space colonization, for the development of the moon and such. And remember, if you look back at the times that we have done the most research in fusion, especially small fusion reactors, it was around this idea that we were going to put fusion rockets into space, and we were going to go way beyond Mars even. We were going to go to Mars and beyond. And that all died when the Mars program died, with really Nixon took the last hack. And so the importance of mining, for example, helium-3, a fusion fuel, on the moon will become extreme, will become very explicit when we have to start to develop the moon, and we're launching, for example, not from Earth, but from the moon and surrounding areas.
Okay, thank you. I think it is, yes. It's very important to emphasize that scientific progress is not simply a question of technical achievement. That the know-how, the principle behind fusion is understood, and the technical achievement to get there could be realized in fairly short order. The reality is this is a political fight, and probably the best and most immediate thing that could be done to achieve fusion on Earth would be the removal of Barack Obama from the office of president and the rest of those treasonous elements who continue to put a cap intentionally on human progress, specifically on fusion. Now, our next question comes from a candidate for the U.S. Senate from the great state of Texas, one Keisha Rogers. And she asks, "Greetings. I recently had the opportunity to tour the Texas A&M University Nuclear Science Research Center. One thing that I found important to note is the tour guide's description of a lack of collaboration and joint work among universities working in these areas of research, or the funding to give equal emphasis to a unified mission in these areas. With the assassination of President Kennedy, our nation has not had a truly unified mission in scientific progress for the nation, except for a vision laid out by Kennedy himself. The slashing of NASA and related programs by our anti-science president, Obama, has certainly left us with no mission. How do we emphasize this urgent importance given the threats coming from our solar system confronting mankind? How do we restore the commitment to true scientific discoveries in our universities and related educational programs? Thank you, Keisha Rogers, candidate for Senate, Texas."
Well, thanks, Keisha, for your question. It's absolutely true that we do need a space mission, not only as a science driver, as something that you ought to have as a good part of development in a general way, but also because of its extreme importance for our survival as a species. Now, a look back at the history of our planet shows that we have had a number of unwelcome events, such as the incredibly large asteroid that struck our planet 65 million years ago, the Little Ice Age of only 700 years ago, which reduced the population in some parts of Europe by 20% because of the failure of crops and the inability to grow food. We will be struck, the planet will be struck by an asteroid that will destroy life on this planet. That will happen. Excuse me, it will be, if we don't do anything, we will be struck. We're guaranteed that it will happen. We don't know exactly when, but it's 100% certain that that event will occur. We don't have to wait for the sun to explode to wipe us out. An asteroid's going to do it before then. Changes in the climate, which occur, and which the changes in the past we have yet to actually understand why they've all happened, these have the potential also to wreak havoc with our well-being. So the importance of space lies both in its existence as the science driver, bar none, along with fusion, and in its urgent application of space science to ensure the protection of human beings on this planet. It seems easy to neglect this concern, or to think, well, we'll take care of asteroids eventually. That seems a little bit far-flung. And besides, can we really be expected to take care of that? I mean, sometimes things happen. Well, that's a bit juvenile. Civilizations that thought that way in the past were wiped out by changes in the climate, were wiped out by ice ages, by sea levels rising, by all sorts of changes that had the potential to disrupt their life. Those are the civilizations that are now dead. Those are the ones that we read about as gone civilizations. We're guaranteed to join them if we do not take seriously the need to understand that the Earth exists in a solar system with millions of rocks in it that could hit us, and in a galaxy and beyond. So not only does it make sense for us as a species to think of ourselves in space, to recognize ourselves as eventually currently a spacefaring civilization, not only will it produce incredible economic benefits, we saw the intense physical value of the Apollo program, where all of the money, the investment that went into getting to the moon, money which obviously wasn't spent on the moon but here on Earth, more than paid itself back by the developments and the technologies that came out of it, particularly in the field of medicine, for example, or our use of satellites today. So it's a no-brainer that space is the major science driver for us and an essential to ensure our continued existence on this planet.
Okay, so this next question actually comes from an associate in Germany who asks, pertains to our continent and not theirs, as pertains to redistribution of water flow of the North American continent, what is wrong with the doctrine of ecosystems, whereby engineers are taught that ecosystems are disastrously affected and thus continental water projects are dangerous?
The main problem with the so-called ecosystems idea, which is very different than the idea of a biosphere or a biosystem, is that underlying the definition of it is the idea that things are fixed. And once you've defined a system that's fixed, you are going to run into problems because nothing is fixed. And so once you try to preserve something as ideally as in a state that it was only traversing, then you will always be disappointed. Now the problem comes in when you're not just thinking that to yourself, but you're trying to impose that fixed state that you've arbitrarily decided on policy. And so, for example, as we've seen, we've gone through Ice Age. The Rocky Mountains at some point didn't exist, not that long ago actually, and parts of the United States were completely underwater. If we had tried to preserve any one point of that, we would see disaster. And so right now, you see that the condition of the United States is incredibly disparaging. You have floods and droughts, often at the same time in the United States, killing people. And so, one, that's the reason we would build Nawapa. But two, right now, the subject of the ecosystem is being used in an incredibly evil way. And I remember I went to a conference where the major argument was being made. The argument that was pervasive throughout the conference was that places that have run into disasters, so Sandy, New Orleans, or and so on, really shouldn't have existed because they built themselves on a place which was ecologically unsound for human beings. Now, really, that argument says every major city in the United States shouldn't have existed because Chicago was a swamp, so was New York, and so was San Francisco. LA was a desert, and so on. So all the fact that human beings exist, for example, in the United States, in a way that we have been able to contribute to knowledge and the development of the biosphere and society and science, is because we've been able to change those environments for the good through our understanding.
Okay, so our next question comes from a organizer who does work on Capitol Hill. And this organizer says, "We recently had a meeting with a pair of staffers on Capitol Hill on the subject of fusion power. In the meeting, the staffers completely agreed with the importance of fusion power and understood the insanity and complete unworkability of so-called green sources of power, solar, wind, etc. The subject of the discussion quickly shifted from the importance of fusion power per se, which was clear to everyone, to the challenge of fighting pessimism and, unfortunately, and uneducated opinions, fighting pessimism and uninformed and uneducated opinions, not only among the general population, but within the halls of Congress and the government itself. I think this is a very important subject, and I'd like you to address this in this public setting, because just having the right ideas is not enough. We have to make them happen, and we have to bring them into being. Can you address the importance of strategic and political leadership in the fight for scientific progress, and, inversely, the role of an understanding of the needed scientific progress in strategy and politics?"
Sure. Leadership in science in addressing this kind of pessimism has to occur outside science. The unfortunate fact of the matter is that the scientific field often is not treating themselves as political leaders right now. They don't see themselves that way. They don't act that way. Many of them are under the delusion that if they simply presented their projects more clearly and better, then they'd be funded because they make such sense. Now, they do make sense, well, many of them. Maybe they could be presented more clearly, but that's really not the issue. I mean, the issue on Capitol Hill, which is sort of sometimes a very stinky place, is that what's right doesn't always happen. That there are other considerations involved besides a purely reasonable interpretation of the well-being of the country. This takes the form, as everyone should be familiar with, of backroom deals, bribes, attacks, threats, physical threats. How does what the NSA is doing, including the inability of its leaders to say they're not spying on the Congress, for example, that's a wonderful opportunity for political blackmail material. I sort of picture the closed-door hearings of the Senate Intelligence Committee when General Alexander comes to brief them, and it's closed doors. He says, "All right, well, here's the briefing. Congressman, I know about your mistress. Congresswoman, I know about your illegal business dealings, and if you don't finance us again, we're going to go public with this. I mean, maybe. But the important thing is that it's outside of science itself. What it means is you need political leadership. I mean, consider the leadership that Lyndon LaRouche has expressed over his adult life since World War II, since his decision to take personal responsibility for the path the United States would take. Coming back after World War II, Mr. LaRouche was aware that we were not headed in a good direction when Truman replaced Roosevelt. With his work as a consultant in the 50s, he came to the conclusion, in 50s and beyond, he came to the conclusion that the United States, the trends governing the United States, would result in its economic destruction, and that this would mean the threat of war, of strategic war, which is exactly where we are today. Now, the leadership he expressed on that, expressed itself in every field. He ran for president. He was created the Fusion Energy Foundation, the largest fusion boosting organization in the United States, and I believe internationally. So the leadership that we need to provide on Capitol Hill takes us outside the realm of science, and it involves taking some of these scientific advisors and making them realize that the changes that need to be made can't be made by a scientist, per se. Be a scientist, by all means, but recognize that the concept of being a scientist could be unnecessarily preventing you from making the points that need to be made specifically about this fight between Prometheus and Zeus. Are we going to progress, or are we going to be killed? These projects aren't just not understood and not explained clearly enough. There's an intention to depopulate the planet, to reduce most of the population that remains to a serf-like state, to go back to the Middle Ages when people knew their places and were stupid and poor, not able to do anything about it, with a few people ruling over them. If that's the direction that we're headed, an excellent and eloquent presentation of fusion isn't enough.
Okay, well, due to the time constraints, we will not be able to take any more of the many questions that have come in over the period of this webcast. What I'd like to do before we close is to ask Jason if, in fact, he has any closing remarks.
Yeah. Let me just close with what we opened with, that Zeus is real. Now, did Zeus actually throw Cronus into Hades in the mythological sense? Okay, that's not what I mean by it being real, per se. But the story expressed by Aeschylus in Prometheus Bound, that's as real as you get. That is the best kernel of comprehension of where civilization has gone over its history and undoubtedly its prehistory. That's the fight. Take a look at the most recent expression of Zeus, the Dutch-British Empire. Take a look at the past century. With the ouster of Bismarck, with the direction to go to World War I, the top Brits, they were explicit about this in their conversations with each other. They didn't want to see cooperation among the land powers of Asia. They didn't want to see the railroad planned to go from Berlin to Baghdad. They prevented its construction along its full length. They hated the thought of Germany and Russia collaborating on projects. They sabotaged economic projects between those two nations and between those nations and the United States. They have halted development worldwide through, for example, take a look at the IMF. A somewhat famous book came out a few years ago by John Perkins called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where he explained how the IMF and similar organizations like the World Bank deliberately destroyed third world nations by putting them in untenable financial situations, where they played with them with monetary power to get them into debt and then to control where they would go. That's the process now taking place in the European Union, where we see the same very foolish decisions that brought Hitler into power in Germany, where confronted with an economic collapse, instead of addressing the reason for that collapse, which is the intentional destruction of the economy, instead a monetarist view is put forward which says if we just pay off these debts, then we can get back to growth, which the United States did not do after the Revolutionary War. But this is now destroying Europe, where countries are being forced to cut back, to cut back, to cut back. There will be no growth. Cuts are not going to create the growth. Only overthrowing this oligarchical system of Zeus with the Promethean outlook, and by increasing the portion of people involved in this who adopt that actually as an identity, who use that concept, who use the understanding of development versus the oligarchy, Prometheus versus Zeus. This must become embedded in the identity of those who would seek to change the direction of human civilization, or it simply will be impossible. So Zeus is real. It's right now he sort of has the appearance of Queen Elizabeth II, which I think is a suitably horrific visage. And Prometheus is real. And it's up to you to decide if that's who you are going to be.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I'd like to thank our two guests, Leona and Jason, for their very valuable contributions. And I'd also like to ask you to make a valuable contribution to the LaRouche PAC. Because while we don't necessarily need the trillions of dollars in credit required to get fusion underway, we do require a certain baseline of financing to continue to lead this fight against against Zeus in the name of Prometheus. So we ask you to contribute, join us in organizing, join us in storming Capitol Hill to get these ideas across, and join us in the streets. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.